Hello everyone to the Intro to 2D Art workshop. In this workshop, we'll be going over some strategies to tackling different art assets, whether they be traditional art assets, pixel art, as well as describing softwares we recommend, careers that you could possibly get out of doing art in games, and some other topics, as well as some activities throughout the workshop that you are more than welcome to pause in order to give yourself time to work on them and then continue the video. So we're going to start with what is game art? So this is the visual and aesthetic aspects of a game. When you're looking at a game, you have your view and you see, you can see mountains in the distance. Maybe there's a table in front of you with some assets on top of it. These are all represented through assets, whether they be 2D or 3D. And so your job is to create visual representations of things you want in your world, uh, and show them off for your player to interact with. So what goes into game art? So there are hard skills such as drawing, modeling, and sculpting, but also softer skills like communication, design, direction. You can put art style in there as well. Um, just basically general ideas on how things will flow and combine together in order to form a cohesive product. There are games out there where if you look at them, technically they might not be the best looking games, but they have a solid art style that's very cohesive and everything goes together to create a cohesive final product. So, what constitutes 2D art? So, essentially, it's anything that's not a three-dimensional object. But getting into more specifics, there are sprite sheets, animations, which lean into sprite sheets. There's UI assets, character design, character assets, environmental assets, which includes tile maps and other forms of environmental assets, VFX and particle effects, concept art, and a lot more. You can see on some of these examples, the bottom, some concept art, top right can be some UI icons used for different weapons or things in a game. So there are lots of things that apply to 2D art, and we'll be going over some of those later. So as for 2D art programs, we mainly recommend for pixel art a sprite. It does cost money. However, there is a free form of it called Libra Sprite, which is essentially just an open source version of a sprite. Um, I highly recommend those. I use them myself a lot, and they're probably the best tools for pixel art. However, if you want a free alternative, go to Piscal. It's it's all right. Other than that, you have Clip Studio Paint, Adobe Illustrator, Paint Tool Sai, Procreate, Krita. All these are great applications for more traditional art as well as pixel art. If you want to just downscale your canvas to a really small size, Fire Alpaca, GIMP, and we've had people use MS Paint. And personally, MS Paint is if you can use MS Paint at an effective level, you have a hidden talent there. Employers will love that. So this gets into kind of the styles of 2D. So things you'll typically see in games is you'll see a lot of pixel art, especially older games on older consoles due to memory restrictions. You can't have as high fidelity images, so people learn to adapt to that and create pixel art. However, as technology develops, and artists get more and more talented by the day. It seems like there's more and more styles that you can incorporate to games. Examples on the bottom being two good ones of having a kind of traditional using traditional art assets but heavily stylized, but the top being pixel art. So in terms of what kind of artists there are within gaming, they vary a lot. These are just four examples. There are a ton more. You have environmental artists who create assets for the environment. These can be completely incredibly varied. At big companies, you could be the tree person or the grass person. Or at a smaller company, you can just be the kind of everything person, but you're in charge of creating those environmental assets. Character artists, they create concept art and eventually go on to fully model and texture models or maybe even work on animation sprite sheets for a 2D avatar. Then you have your visual effects artists, so you can see those examples at the bottom, some visual effects. As well, technical artist, which is an example of that in the bottom left, but that's kind of working with material, material planes and messing with that kind of stuff. But there are a ton more than this. These are just some examples that you'll see often. And so before we dive into these activities, we're going to talk about some art processes you can go through while creating art. This is leaning more towards people who have not really done drawing or art or anything like that before, and giving you a good point of reference to where how we would approach this coming in. So this is my take on traditional, like my process on traditional art. You don't have to follow it, but it is the process I use and the one I find very effective, as well as ones that a lot of artists also use. But when it comes to traditional art, starting with a very rough, loose sketch, so you can do a lot of editing to it, whether you don't like the shape of something, or your perspective was a little bit off, or maybe you just don't like it at all and want to restart. Keeping it rough and keeping it light with, very light strokes that aren't digging deep into the paper or anything like that. They're easy to erase, to change, or whatnot. And in a digital format, keeping it rough has the same principles. You you won't have problems with erasing it and whatnot, but keeping it rough just to get that idea down is the most important part. Because then you can go back later on a new layer or on the same piece of paper, whether if you're doing it physically, you can create a more detailed sketch where you kind of create the definitive version of that line, like smoothing out the curves, making sure it's not shaky. You know what your shape is now. Now you can really define that line. So once those are done, you can then go on to blocking out color. So what I like to do is find what colors I want to use as my base, whether I'd be working on a character and I block out their skin and the color of their clothes. The main idea is just to get your palette down, throw it onto your character, see what it looks like, and adjust it as needed. And then once you have your base colors down, you can go back for a final coat of paint, adding your darks and your lights to give some highlights and to further give dimension to your piece. So that's a typical art process. So with that in mind, we move on to our first activity. So throughout this workshop, we're going to be working with creating some game collectibles. So we have some examples on screen, but the idea behind this is you will take 15 minutes. You can take more or less time, but you're going to create your own game collectible uh, based on if you want to replicate one of these, you may. If you want to come up with your own, say, oh, that strawberry from Celeste looks really cool. What if it was an orange? I'll make an orange instead. Let's try that. So just do a rough sketch. We're going to be doing this in traditional art using that process we just went over, and do your best to just get a good sketch down because we'll be reusing that later on to stylize it and improve upon it. So feel free to pause here. I'm going to keep moving on, but if you want to work on this, pause now. All right, moving on. So pixel art. So the basic process behind pixel art is starting with a basic silhouette. Unlike traditional art, it's really hard to understand the shape of an object just through an outline because the fidelity of the image is so unclear and the pixel density is really low. You can't get as defined curves or as in-depth shapes as you would like with line art. It's just the pixels take up too much space. So, starting with a basic silhouette, it may be if you're working on a character, making the arms different colors in the torso so you can see them in contrast. Basically, you doing that and basically carving your shape is the best approach. So you're skipping the lines. We'll come back and do those later if you want it, but it's nice to get that shape down first. So once you get that down, then you can start working in the details. So let's say you're working on this character's head. You've carved the shape for their head. You you put down some hair and you like how the hair looks and its shape. Now we can start going in and be like, okay, I want the eyes here. I want a mouth here. Maybe this is a female and they have some bow in their hair, or she has a hat on of some kind. Some very some various things that uh, you can start to add on more since you know how the shape is and the perspective is at this point. But once the silhouette is complete, then going back and adding base colors. So for that previous kind of stage of carving it out, highly recommend using temporary colors. For example, going back to that character example, if I'm making a head, I'm going to have a bright red for the skin, maybe a bright blue for the hair. So they're very distinct and you can easily tell the difference. But now I'm going to go back, replace those colors with some final versions, and then start to work on shading and trying to give it dimension through color, which includes the next step, which is touching up details. So if I'm working on this hair, maybe adding some highlights to her hair, maybe adding some dark spots at the end. Maybe her tips are really dark compared to the rest. That'll help show the length of the hair. Um, but that's really the final step. Now you know the shape, the color, just adding those details. And once you're done, you're done. So with this in mind, let's work on taking what you worked on before. So that sketch of that collectible you have, use that to create pixel art version of it. They can be in any pixel ratio you want. The examples on here are from NES games or games with similar aspect ratios, but feel free to go even bigger, as big as you want. But the focus of this is to be pixel art, so don't go too big because at that point it's not really pixel art, it's just a low texture image or a low quality texture. So take about 15 minutes. We're going to move on through the presentation onto the final stage and talk about a little bit more. Okay. And now finally, we're going to talk a little bit about animation. So this is not my forte, so bear with me, but I can give you the basic overview. So for a regular animation process, you're going to want to storyboard your animation. So that's mainly focusing on keyframes, which are the kind of highlights of your animation. For example, if you were to make a animation of someone throwing a ball, maybe you have a keyframe of them standing still, then them winding up, and then the release. So those are kind of your three main states where they're standing, they're in the middle of the throw, they're at the end of the throw. So those will be your keyframes, which will be a good basis for your storyboard. And then in between those, you can sketch your in between frames. So what does this character look like between them standing still and them winding up for this throw? Maybe their leg comes up, the torso turns, their arms kind of separate, something like that. And then once you kind of get those ideas down, you can start to get the line work between those. And this kind of turns into our previous traditional art process of focusing on each of these and turning these rough sketches into more detailed sketches and getting the color down and how's the color going to change between each frame. Maybe if you have shading on your animation and your light source is to the right, it's going to shine on different parts of the body throughout your animation because the body's moving. So that forearm that might be really bright because the point of light is right there. If you turn your throw animation, they're starting to cock their arm in. It's not going to be as bright anymore. So you have to adjust for that. So trying to get those basic ideas of where the light is and whatnot throughout your storyboard and rough sketch of it is very important. So how does this apply for games? It's very similar actually. So you're gonna come up with your idea, get your keyframes down. Then once you have your keyframes going through and starting to create those in between frames, then once you have your basic idea and rough sketches of what you're doing, using that traditional art or even that pixel art process we use to really create those frames into fully fledged art pieces that will flow into each other. And then once you have that down, you should have a solid animation. So with that in mind, we go into our final exercise. This is some extra credit. You don't have to do this. The purpose of this 2D art workshop was to introduce you to some basic art concepts and art in video games, and we will be having a more detailed animation workshop later on. However, based on what was just kind of shown to you, if you feel like you're up to it to create your own animation, then here's some ideas for how you could tackle it. So using that same collectible that you've been creating this whole time, now that you have a pixelated version, assume that's one of your keyframes. I would take that as maybe one of the red ones. Um, like it can be that front view and then kind of creating that second keyframe. So maybe it's rotating. And so you kind of have that front view for that first one, and then that second keyframe is where it's sideways. And then you're creating those in between frames, which are signified by the blue, of it mid turn. So you can have a 4 frame animation where it's flat, turned at 45, then it's parallel to the screen, then back to 45, then perpendicular. But you feel free to do whatever you want with your animation. It's your piece. Um, but if you want to do this, take some time. This might take a much longer than previous ones, but now that you have your basic idea behind your pixel art for your collectible, it shouldn't be too hard to iterate off that. So during the actual workshop, we played some Gartic phone. This is a recording post workshop, so we will not be playing. However, it's very fun. So if you have some friends, highly recommend grabbing them and playing some Gartic phone. And finally, here are some resources we recommend for various forms of art. Um, Personal favorite of mine is Brandon James Greer, very good pixel art YouTube channel. However, these other people are really good as well, very talented. So they have lots of tutorials, or even just they show their process on different pieces. So they might have a uh, time lapse of some piece they're working on, or they'll try a um, new software, art software. They'll try a new art style or something. So even if you're in the same position, if you're in the position where you're not sure where to start or whatnot, you can see these people who are very experienced kind of also be in that same predicament. So there's lots of good reasons to kind of go to these people and for good resources. And thank you for coming. So next week is our game design workshop. So that's specifically on some minor aspects of game design, but it also asset implementation. So we'll be covering, now that you know how to create 2D assets, how do we put them in our engine and how can we use them in our game? And so that's what we will be covering next time. So please, if you're watching this and are still here, please scan the QR code to give us some feedback on what you think of this workshop. And appreciate you watching this and hope you have a fun time working on some art.